Lemonade Originals.
Hello, and welcome to the Lemonade Originals Roundtable series. I'm Trevor Dudak, Chief Strategist for Lemonade.
And I'm Rowan Brooks, Chief Creative Director.
And today we'll be discussing how to make human connections in the digital era.
As the world becomes increasingly connected, it also seems to get more divided. At Lemonade, we believe in the power of connection through content that builds bridges and breaks down walls. So we've invited some media-savvy experts to join today's discussion. On our panel today, we have writer and freelance creative director Laurel Stark-Ackerman, who is co-founder of the One Club for Creativity's Next Creative Leaders, Brett Blount, media strategist and communications director at Sift, a SaaS platform for digital trust and safety. Nikki Selkin, interactive designer and emoji artist. She runs the Artists Incubator and education programs at Grey Area. And Mike Prasad, CEO of Tiny Sponsor, helping brands and advertisers work directly with creators and influencers. Welcome.
Great. So, Laurel, perhaps we can start with you. In the work that you've done with brands, what have you found to be effective in ensuring that you reach your audience in an authentic way?
I think it's really important when you're targeting a certain audience to make sure that you're actually working with and that your team reflects the audience that you're trying to reach. I think that's the key in making sure that you're creating authentic connections and also that you're being true to the stories that you're trying to tell. So one of the biggest things that went into the campaign that we developed for Google's Pride last year was making sure that the creative team, as well as the support team that we had, reflected the LGBTQ plus community. And this not only went into the way that we staffed our own project, but it went into the way that we ran things by an internal group within our agency, making sure that we opened it up to discussion and ran the work by other people within that community that worked within our agency. It also went through to making sure that people on the Google side who belong to that community were involved in the process. And even in some of the creative collaborators that we chose, we went out of our way to work with an LGBTQ plus artist, Rooney Simmons, who was actually quite active in the community and already had a following himself, to make sure that every touch point that we had, the conversations that we were having actually included the people in the product itself. And in that way, we were able to make some really brave, really beautiful work that actually engaged the community. And not only on the Google side where they felt good about what they were saying, but we got a lot of positive reinforcement, a lot of positive press from the LGBTQ plus audience itself. And I think that that's how you really gauge success, at least in my view, is that it meant something to them.
Yeah, sometimes it seems so simple, right? Include your audience, but a lot of people miss that step.
It's a really hard thing to do. And I think, especially if you look at who makes up who are the media makers, it's traditionally been a very white, very male audience. And so I think just being aware, a lot of the leaders, we still are white, we still are male. I think just being aware as we're hiring, and also aware of our own internal biases and making sure that as we do staff, that we are aware of whose voices are not included and make sure that we are trying to actively include them, actively trying to hire, actively trying to give them a platform to speak their truth.
And then I'll open this up to the group. So maybe what's the best way that we can show our brand communities that we care?
One of the things that I feel like unifies this entire table here is storytelling. And I think that authenticity is paramount, right? Like, I think you can show your community you care and that you know who they are and that you understand them by producing authentic content. I feel like that's sort of the nucleus of our programming, and then it gets into how we reach them and how disruptive that is. But in general, I think authenticity in terms of the creative and the execution, and how much freedom we have to create content that's authentic is critical.
I think context is super important. And look at content and narrative. Context is everything. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times you might have a brand saying, we really care about our audience, and they might mean that, but they'll pick a singular messaging or a singular thing across multiple types of audiences, and recognizing that an audience or a consumer base isn't like one or two or five sets. It's probably like a dozen subsets that each have their own content that makes something specific or non-specific, and understanding that nuance is what really communicates authenticity versus just like, oh, we care, we're doing this initiative, it's great, but if you don't take it to where they are, it's actually not going to convert.
Agreed.
I think experience as a whole is also really important to consider, because you can say, oh, we're a brand that cares about someone, we're a brand that speaks to everybody. But if that doesn't actually come across in your consumer's experience of your brand, that's a challenge. And I think that that's where we have to really look at bringing our audience in and understanding how they experience us, understanding how where we might miss the mark, and kind of being able to iterate. And I think social is a great place to do that, because you can test, you can put things out and see how people react. And if it misses the mark, you can do something different next time. And I think it's like that in any sort of digital experience, whether it's your website and how easy it is to navigate, or an app and how hard it is to launch, or where you're finding that you might have a challenge in going through a process that you need to do to use the app. Anything like that, where you can actually really take a look at the experience that you're putting out there and how people are reacting to it or how they're experiencing it, because that is your brand in action. And so I think really understanding how your audience experiences you in all of your different touch points is so paramount for them to feel like they're understood and like you get them, like you care.
The consistency is super important. If you go from one message or one campaign to a website to a product experience, and there's not a underlying consistent thread, then there's a disparity there and there's a gap there, and something like, wait, well, that doesn't make sense to me. And that doubt actually can pervade into the overall brand experience. That's really bad. When you're looking at testing as well, it's important. A lot of brands worry about testing too much on their main brand because that's a risk. But there's a lot of interesting ways in social, especially, to work with influencers or content creators to test micro audiences, to get feedback with it being explicitly separate from the primary brand, so you can experiment and fine tune before you push it to your larger audience.
Group, how much of a factor does relevancy play in your efforts to build an online community?
I feel like that's an oxymoron in a way, because relevance is the basis of an online community. So you have to have underlying messaging and value sets that are relevant to the audience for the community to exist. When you look about putting together culture, like a community is basically, in its best form, develops into a culture. And if you look at what makes a culture, if you look at historically, culture has been largely built from where you grew up, what was around you. Like you think about food, Italian dish is definitive or defined based on the ingredients that were local. But you look in the online world, culture is spontaneous. Memes are spontaneous culture creation. And so when you're looking at building community, you've got to understand what are the elements of the culture that you're trying to curate. And it's not always going to be from the brand. It's going to be from your audience and what they incorporate into their daily lives. And understanding what those elements are and saying, great, this is their daily life, this is our values. Here is this one element here, maybe it's aesthetic, or it's a value set, or even a color. And saying this is relevant to them, and it's also relevant to us. Let's find that bridge, bring those elements together, and then that becomes a framework for your community. And as long as it's relevant on both sides, then that creates a framework where the culture grows around it and becomes self-sustaining.
Why do you want to be a part of the conversation, or why does it make sense for you to show up? Because especially in the social space, people are there because they're enjoying themselves. They're there to be a part of a conversation, to have fun, to be entertained. Sometimes it's about learning. They want to learn about things that interest them. So I think if you're a larger brand especially, I think it's all about deciding, like, does it make sense for you to be there? And if so, like, how do you show up authentically in that conversation to show your target audience that you belong there, and so that you're just a part of the authentic experience that they have of that social platform, and you're joining the conversation in a way that adds kind of to the flavor of things without making it feel like a sales tool. And I think one of the ways that you can do that in the social space is to do social listening and really kind of hone in on who you're trying to target and how they're talking, what they're talking about. Hashtags are a great way to do that. And so we've had a lot of success, especially with Gen Z targeting, to actually bring brands into the conversation in a fun way where they can kind of react to things that people are already talking about. And that's also really fun content to do, because you can literally see what people are talking about. And with social, you can create content very quickly and put it out there and be part of a relevant conversation in a fun way that creates that brand affinity, but also doesn't make it feel like you shouldn't be there or like you're pushing yourself into the conversation where you don't belong.
One key point to what you said is come with no assumptions. Like, don't assume it, because we're so-and-so, people are going to love us or they're going to hate us. I've worked with one brand where they were looking at a new audience, like, oh, well, our reputation will precede us and it'll be great and we'll just show up and everyone will love us. And they showed up and everyone was like, who are you guys? And so come with no assumptions. I think you have to really take that time to listen and understand, what that audience cares about, why you're even there, why you're relevant to them, outside of what you think, because that's usually going to differentiate be different a little bit.
Yeah.
You guys know this as well as any of us, that a lot of these brands struggle with, disassociating themselves with the content a bit, right? I mean, they assume that the traditional advertising or traditional communications is directly to the root of their own product message, when it's the opposite. The opposite is generally true online, right? Where you actually have to create something that's authentic, that these enthusiasts or these communities really appreciate, and that's going to be outside of the brand. They can have that positive brand association, but tying it too close to the brand is basically wasting money, resources, and creative, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, there's something about, I think it was the Harry Potter verse. So of all the books and all the words ever written about Harry Potter, I think it's comprised only like 1% or something of the that J.K. Rowling wrote, or about 1% of the actual volume of work created in the Harry Potter verse, because the majority of it is through fandom, like fan fiction, video, stories, art. It's so when you think about it that way, you're creating a seed and a genesis through your product or your IP that is then creating a life of its own. And we used to think of our brands as the center of the universe, but now really the consumer is the center of the universe, and we're floating around them, and they just pick what they want to touch. And the other thing you were saying before about relevancy and what we bring our product or our brand or idea to the market, and we're like, okay, you know who we are. I was teaching a class, I teach classes, and one of my students, it was something about memes. I was like, pick a meme and like explore it. And my students did something with Pepe the Frog, and halfway through their presentation, I was like, guys, this just got co-opted by the alt-right, so let's have a talk about that in class. If you were using this to do a fun, art piece or design brand, whatever, you've suddenly got a whole other can of worms associated with this. And you have to know what's going on in social before you launch your campaign or your art piece or whatever, because it's so important. Like it's grown past you at that point.
Yeah, and that's kind of the next question we even have too, is how important is it to read and respond to your comments? Because I think a lot of brands overlook the value of that, right?
There's comments like a part of this bigger idea. I think what you identified slightly, I would argue a little bit. So you said there's the brand, and they know what they're very egocentric, right? And then you have how people have taken like the Harry Potter universe and content and created this larger universe around it, and then they pick and choose. And I think there's kind of actually 3 levels to that, right? So the brand is like their core messaging. If you're a brand, you really want to think about this. It's like, what is my core messaging? What do I stand for? What is my product about? What is my experience about? And that's the official framework by which you operate on. But then there's a secondary framework that you need to consciously create, which is this idea of, okay, great, what is it that we definitely want to say, we want to engage, that bridges the audience, more flexible, but that we may not necessarily say ourselves. Things that maybe we can't say, or things that we do want to say, but it won't feel authentic coming from us. So this is kind of like the idea between where some companies will create fan kits where fans can get assets and images and filters and make their own content with it. And you see that with like Harry Potter stuff, you see that with like gaming especially. But there's a difference between when that happens spontaneously and when a company actually engineers that. And I think it's really cool that you do engineer that. You say, listen, this is who we are, but then our fan takes it in a whole different way. Let's give them the tools to make sure that they're taking it in a way that is somewhat aligned with what we care about and doesn't go too far off course. And then you take that, see what people create with it, and then as it grows, you'll have more and more content and more messaging and more creativity from the community, and you inject that back into the brand. And so it's this 3-level process where you're actually creating iterative intake and output that allows you to build this community, build this culture, and then really zero in on the messaging that you're not going to really get, there's no way you're going to get it internally.
It's almost like prototyping and messaging through external people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can
methods.
R&D through social now,
Yeah.
and a lot of people overlook that value, right? There's a value to traditional research, but there's a huge value to R&D through social, through all of those platforms that we can use now.
What do we want this experience to look like, and how do we want these people to walk away feeling about the brand and socializing the brand or any of these assets associated with the campaign? I think that's this new sort of universal truth, is to start with that experience and build from there.
And then having that framework is super critical. so many brands don't think about. They think about us and them versus like what is that framework that we're building that we define that is for them, not for us, right? And that's a really different mentality. And comment listening is a big part of that, seeing what people are saying and also knowing what to ignore, right? Like I think ultimately it's not all about the consumer either. Like they're coming to you from a guide experience that was all about them. They'd be doing their own thing. But if it's something where they're adapting some of what you create, you're almost like the director. You're sort of like letting them take it where they want, but you've got to give them that framework. And listening to comments is a big part of that, and understanding what are they saying, and also thinking, well, how much of that is really just irrelevant, and how much of that is super relevant. And if it's irrelevant, well, then why are they saying it in the first place? And then going back to that, say, does that align with our framework that we really want to promote, or do we try and redirect it?
We were talking a little bit about the authenticity and how important that is. Because if you do have that two-way conversation, which I think social makes happen whether you want it or not, right? So it's better to plan to be a part of a conversation, in my opinion. It sounds like you're advocating for that as well, proactively. Because if it doesn't feel authentic, you will hear about it. And I think that we're seeing a lot of that kind of come through now as we've had some more of like the fempowerment generation, or, in situations where we say like for International Women's Day, like the pink washing of things or the rainbow washing for Pride, where you actually get people calling you out and saying, this is really tone deaf because your company's policies don't actually support this group. So it's very tone deaf for you to be putting out a celebratory message and getting on this bandwagon. And I think that those are really important conversations to have because they make us as media makers, as brands, they make us have to do the hard thinking about what we're putting out, what we're saying is related to our brand. If it doesn't actually feel authentic, we will be called out about it and it will be very public because that's what social media has opened up. And I personally see it as an opportunity to engage with people who can call us out and make us, maybe shine a light on where our blind spots are, and maybe also say, hey, here's an opportunity, instead of just putting out, instead of being like, Pride's coming up, we want to do something that speaks to this community. It's really like, hey, before we go ahead and jump the bandwagon and put out marketing that maybe doesn't feel like that maybe we can't really speak to where we are right now as a company, how about we take a look inside and see if we do want to support this community, if we do want to be a part of that conversation, what are we doing internally to support that community? Do our own hiring processes support that community? Those sorts of things that actually make sure that our brand and the identity of our brand and who we want to be as a brand actually is reflected in the marketing that we put out there. Because I think that there's an opportunity there to make sure that we are the best versions of ourselves. And I think that that's what's so important about having that two-way discussion.
If what you care about is actually part of that, you want to definitely leverage that, but you also don't want to come off as being fake or opportunistic. And part of that is also that the best opportunities, especially with social, you get called out on that, but it's also the best opportunities for growth come from these things you can't predict. And so if you approach it in a way that's very open-minded, that's very collaborative, you find opportunities from the community that you're trying to connect with to collaborate with them to actually find a new opportunity that's mutually beneficial, and that more than often than not becomes that viral phenomenon that you want, but you literally could not engineer without that collaborative element.
And it's not that complicated if you think about it. I mean, you talk about just supporting these communities, right? Like, and simply doing so could be advertising campaign. It could be driving social awareness to their cause. It could be telling their story, right? Mm-hmm. Not telling your story, but telling their story. I mean, I've done this with you guys, and it's it's like, okay, who are you trying to target? What do they care about? Let's talk to some of these people. Let's get their story out there. And that could be all that it takes. But, it's not rocket science.
In a way, you are the pedestal for them in a way. So you're providing them the stage. You don't need, like a lot of times, again, brands can be very egocentric, but saying, hey, I own the stage, but let me put you on it. And you can tell your story. And it's not about me, I'm just supporting someone that has a real message.
That's right.
And then usually that's enough. That's more than enough.
And that's for being responsible and using their platform for good.
And it also gives you the right to participate in the narrative because you're supporting it. It doesn't have to be a direct brand correlation. It just could be shared values.
So there's a lot of opportunity in social right now. Can you maybe talk through, some of the opportunities that you see?
Yeah, social's an ever-changing landscape. There's algorithm changes like every week on different platforms. It can be very confusing. I think what brands and marketers should do is go back to the basics and say, great, well, we know there's this ever-changing landscape, and one of the traps that people fall into is they think of social and think of, especially when brands focus, it's Instagram, and that's actually not the entire world of social. Like Instagram, part of it, you got YouTube, which they'll think about too as well. Sometimes people think of Twitter, but after that, it kind of drops off. And then you have all these other platforms. You have TikTok, you have LinkedIn, you have like a lot of these other micro platforms that are coming up that are smaller audience, more niche, a lot of short form video. And so all of these platforms are different opportunities and there's different formats. So depending on what your goals are, you can really choose what format and what audience and what content style matches what your needs are. So for example, at Tiny Sponsor, we look at the goals in a social campaign as one of 5 things. It's narrative and telling a story. It is building a direct audience, driving an action or a click, content creation, just pure value of that, and then also research and testing. So depending on what your goals are, you want to really look at the platform and the format. So on Instagram, for example, if you're looking for e-commerce conversion, you really want to focus on Instagram stories because you can actually tap a link in that to go buy versus Instagram feed posts, which are not going to have as high of a conversion. But those are really great for storytelling. If you want to look at content creation and you want to trigger a massive wave of content creation, TikTok's a huge untapped opportunity right now, if that's your demographic, which is a younger demographic. There was a campaign that is live now for the movie Shazam, and it's a hashtag Shazam Up on TikTok, where they created a custom Shazam filter, video filter, where it makes a bolt of lightning shoot out, and then you can transform yourself. In about 2 weeks, there's over 100 million views of user-generated videos where all these independent creators created these Shazam transformation videos on TikTok. And the end screen is the Shazam title and the opening date. So literally 100 million views by tens of thousands of creators which was generated in 2 weeks. And it was insane. So I think understanding the platforms, the format, what goal it maps back to, and what that content mechanically supports is really critical. And if you map it that way, the algorithms will change, and there might be a lot of changes in terms of what's hot and what's not, but in guaranteeing whatever you're going to do is going to be effective for your needs.
Yeah, and I think that brings up the interesting topic of user-generated content, which has been shown recently to generate even up to 20% more influence with millennials in terms of purchase decisions. So I think a question for brands, especially those who haven't used it yet, is how do they plan and integrate a user-generated content strategy, right? How do they go about that and still protect the brand, but let people be authentic in their content creation?
It's pretty simple, I think. Once you define what your brand messaging is, and you understand what your external messaging is, kind of what we talked about earlier, which is the idea of a framework of this is what we want to give people to take and run with. Like a lot of the Shazam videos in this example were not really appropriate for the movie, but a lot of them were. So highlighting and resharing and promoting the ones that are, that becomes what's visible. Everything else will eventually get buried. And so you can actually pick and choose. So it's a great way to test out and not take a big brand risk because you're really going to allow the community to drive that and then just put the ones that are the best and most appropriate on the pedestal.
There is a bit of a risk there, though. I mean, you talk about those that were less appropriate, right? And that they may get buried in search, but some of them may also surface and be socialized. So,
but if it's not by you and you're not endorsing it, it's fine. So like even in...
Oh, no, totally agree. But there could be some sort of brand damage sustained from something like that. Or that's an example of how something could go sideways. Maybe not for the Shazam campaign, but like...
for other campaigns, you've seen
other
that.
campaigns.
And social listening is really key to that. And if something's really bad happens, come out and condemn it. This is not who we are. But that's a rare situation. Right. And for the most part, communities tend to self-police, for the most part. And there's also ways to essentially reinforce the good values and then let the other ones kind of, again, bury themselves. Or if it gets really bad, you come out against it.
I have a question about Instagram. You at Tiny Sponsor work with influencers. So how does that build connection to brands, and how do you test the authenticity of that connection?
Sure, this applies to any platform, I think, not just Instagram, just kind of the hot one right now.
Right.
So this idea of authenticity, consistency, is super important across all marketing forms, obviously, but I think in social it's specifically important. At Tiny Sponsor, we have this score called resonance. And it's something that goes into our algorithm. And resonance looks at the overlap between the creator, their content, their audience, the brand product, the brand campaign messaging, and the brand. And if you actually look at the overlap of consistency and alignment across every step, when it goes all the way through, we have what we call resonance. When you see a high level of resonance, you start having 2, 3, 4, 5x, 10x conversion rate Because what ends up happening, and this is very obvious when you think about it, is that if I'm working with an influencer or a content creator who's an expert in, let's say, face masks, and I'm a face mask company, and her audience is primarily the skin type that we service, and she's going to try it out, one, she's going to have a good experience, and two, you know that she has a high brand alignment on multiple levels with her audience. Her relation with her audience is very well aligned, and she also has a good alignment with you as a brand, and so all that flows through, and it's consistency, and it ends up being a really good conversion funnel, so to speak. And so I think when you look at authenticity and how to do it right, you've got to look at those multiple levels of connections, but when it works, it really works, and it outperforms any other media type.
I'm curious, Nikki, with some of the emoji art that you do, how does that play into some of these topics about relevance and authenticity, when you're creating art?
Yeah, I would say, the piece that I worked on was a crowdsourced emoji dictionary, but I also run an emoji blog that covers emoji art and culture. And one of the things I think that's really interesting about emoji is that it is technically another language. That we know that because it was adopted by Unicode as a web language, which is so is Cyrillic in Spanish. And you have to go through a long process to get that to happen. But furthermore, there's a lot of young people, I think millennials and then below, what is that? Is that Gen Z?
Z.
Yeah.
Z.
Are fluent in emoji for the most part. And Gen Z grew up with it. And because of that, I started studying it in 2013 as its own meaning-making tool. And I think that it exists because we've, as communication has kind of moved further and further away from face-to-face communication, it's got kind of distilled down from letters to phone calls to emails, from emails to tweets, from tweets to emoji tweets and texts. And we look at that as an abstraction of language. And what the other thing that's super interesting is that when an emoji or even an emoticon that's a facial expression hits your brain, it hits the right side of your brain, which is not the language processing center, but is the emotional processing center of your brain. So it gives you the same feeling in your brain that you would when you saw someone smile or frown or cry, which is very interesting if you think of a generation of people who've grown up without even hearing the tone of someone's voice on the phone. And that then 99% of their communication when they're not in front of their friend is with emojis and words. You're filling in the gap for something that's been lost. And so, I've worked on this and interviewed young people and old people and all kinds of people, user testing, and the young people are like, yeah, if you don't send an emoji in a tweet or text, it means you're mad at me. That there has to be this connotation. And it softens the blow by giving it emotional context. And I've noticed, even for myself, if some email gets sent with an emoji in this subject, I'm I'm opening this. It's like a horrible newsletter.
Can you send emoji in a subject?
Yes,
I didn't even know you could
can.
All right.
Remember that,
All right.
marketing people.
Right.
My boss just made a chart, or my operations manager made a chart of accounts with emoji for each line item, and I was suddenly yes, I love this financial meeting that previously I would have been
It's the new bullet point, right? Emoji is the new bullet point.
telling
But
you.
kind of true, right? It's this thing that has multiple levels of meaning. It's an iconic thing that allows some subjective adaptation, right? And there's a lot of emojis in different subgroups have also different contexts. When we work with influencers and we look at messaging and what they're doing, we want to give them a message to take from the brand, but we want them to put in their own words. And we'll see people take it in so many different directions, and emojis are a really big part of that.
Right.
It also reminds me of certain languages. So you look at English language. English has so many specific words. It's one of the hardest language people to master because there's so many nuanced variations. You look at other languages that are technically have less words in the overall alphabet, or the overall dictionary, like Japanese, for example, right? One
It's an
word.
ideographic language.
Exactly.
And it hits your brain on the right side versus the left because we have a script-based language.
Yeah.
And that's why there's no incidences of dyslexia in China.
Interesting.
Anyway, continue.
But that's the data, right? So you're taking this thing and you're giving it multiple meanings and context. And I think emojis allow you to bring in part of yourself and part of your environment. And the whole Gen Z thing, without an emoji, it feels dead. It feels not personal. And that makes perfect sense.
And also that the Japanese invented emoji, and
and
they invented it, and it came out of the fact that their own language, their own characters get used as ideographic symbols in shorthand, in a way that we don't do except for maybe kind of is but we don't do it because we have a script-based language, and their characters are 3D objects. So emoji is really important, and I actually think that well, Richard Shallon, this guy, has an idea that since the advent of TV, this is before emoji even, our brains are becoming more and more right brain because that's where the pictures are hitting us. And I think that emoji is just an automatic, like, what's happening because of this move from right to left brain. And they say people who are dyslexic and right-handed, which is me, have, like, instead of a 80-20 split, or maybe like 90% of their language is in their left, they're more about 70% of the language in their left and 30% is in the right brain. So I think that we're moving toward a right-brained focused culture because of all the visual marketing and communication. And therefore it makes sense that we'd be using an ideographic language that is universal. Although there are translation problems, if you see the girl with her hand like this in the US, it means like whatever, and in Japan it means a server, like serving you. So there's a lot of translation issues across cultures, so don't assume that all emoji are.
But again, context is super important, right? And actually makes a lot of sense that we're culturally shifting to this ideographic communication form. If you look at where social platforms and media is being created, right? Like we went from blogs and Twitter to YouTube to Instagram and short form video, where it's very compact, it's very focused, and 100% visual.
It certainly helps to punctuate, text messaging. I mean, you send a text message, and if there's any humor, if there's any emotion in that at all, if you don't punctuate it with that, then you're just almost like setting yourself up to
misinterpretation and everything. Yeah,
right.
You're mad at them.
That's right.
Especially like those of us that are like word people and super sarcastic, I always have to end up sending like three emoji follow-ups that are like, I do the like this face a lot.
Maybe some flowers, some real flowers.
And then sparkles. Sparkles is my other one. A lot of sparkles.
All right, so with that, we'll thank all our guests and our viewers. And if you'd like to see any more content like this from Lemonade Originals, please hit like and subscribe. Thanks.
Lemonade Originals.